On September 17, 2025, the state of Florida carried out one of its most controversial executions in decades. After more than 34 years on death row, David Pittman was put to death for the brutal 1988 murders of 3 members of the Knowles family in Mulberry, Florida. His case drew national attention, not only for the horror of the crime, but also for the decades of appeals, the questions about intellectual disability, and his final words from the execution chamber. This is not just a story of a crime. It is a story of a man who spent over 3 decades fighting the state, proclaiming innocence until his very last breath. As we uncover his journey from conviction to execution, I want you to subscribe to this channel for more in-depth true crime stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Was his justice served or a haunting mistake? Because what happened on that September night in 1988 set in motion a chain of events that would not end until 34 years later, inside Florida State Prison. And it all begins with the night the Knowles family lost everything. The story of David Pittman is one that stretches across decades, shadowed by poverty, violence, and ultimately, the death chamber of Florida State Prison. Born in 1959, Pittman's early life was marked by instability and hardship. Defense lawyers later pointed to a troubled childhood and intellectual limitations, citing test scores that placed him in the low 70s IQ range. They argued these struggles shaped the man he became. But no claim of disability or trauma could erase the crime for which Pittman would become infamous. In the early morning hours of June 1988, the quiet community of Mulberry, Florida was shattered. 3 members of the Knowles family were found dead inside their home. Clarence and Barbara Knowles, along with their adult daughter Bonnie, had been brutally murdered. Prosecutors argued that Pittman, estranged from another Knowles daughter, carried out the attack in anger and desperation. The details were grim: a triple homicide, followed by an attempt to cover the crime by setting the home on fire. The brutality of the crime left Polk County stunned. A family that had been well known in their community was gone in a single night. Investigators quickly focused on Pittman, and within months he was facing trial. By 1991, a jury convicted him of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The death penalty was imposed, and Pittman's fate was sealed. He would spend the rest of his days on death row. But for David Pittman, that sentence would not be carried out quickly. Instead, it would lead to a 34-year battle in the courts, one that tested not only the evidence against him, but the very limits of America's death penalty system. After his 1991 conviction, Pittman entered the long and grueling cycle that defines death row in America. Appeal after appeal, motion after motion, each one seeking to delay or overturn the inevitable. His legal team centered much of their argument on intellectual disability. Under U.S. Supreme Court precedent, the state is prohibited from executing individuals with significant cognitive impairments. Pittman's attorneys argued that his IQ scores, along with documented childhood neglect, prove he fell under this protection. But Florida's courts were unmoved. Judges acknowledged his background, but ruled that Pittman did not meet the legal threshold for exemption. The years stretched on. For more than 3 decades, Pittman lived in near total isolation, confined to a cell the size of a bathroom. He became one of Florida's longest-serving death row prisoners, watching as others were led to the execution chamber, while his own fate was delayed by the slow grinding of legal procedure. Each petition denied brought him closer to an unavoidable end. By 2025, the appeals had run dry. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Pittman's death warrant, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final request for relief. After 34 years of waiting, David Pittman's countdown to execution was no longer measured in years or months. It was now a matter of hours. On September 17th, 2025, the final chapter of David Pittman's life began to close. Inside the gray, fortified walls of Florida State Prison in Stark, Pittman awoke knowing that this was the last sunrise he would ever see. His attorneys filed emergency motions until the very last moment, but by mid-afternoon, all legal avenues had closed. prison officials followed protocol. Inmates scheduled for execution are offered a final meal, and Pittman's request was noted. Fried chicken, steak, biscuits, chocolate, and soda. The tray was delivered to his cell. Witnesses later said that he ate quietly, slowly, with little visible emotion. He touched the chicken first, then moved the biscuits, and finally sipped the soda. There was no indulgence in his eating, only the solemn routine of a man marking his final hours. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters gathered with signs reading "Stop Executions" and "Justice, not Death." They prayed and chanted against what they saw as state-sanctioned killing. Inside, Pittman was untouched by their voices. His world had narrowed to the countdown of the clock, the sound of guards' boots in the hallway, and the inevitability of what awaited him. At 5 p.m., officers shackled Pittman at the wrists and ankles. He was led down the long corridor toward the execution chamber. Step by step, the life he had fought to hold on to for 34 years was drawing to its state-sanctioned end. But before the needle touched his skin, Pittman would be given one last opportunity, his final words. And the world waited to hear whether he would show remorse, or once again deny the crime that defined his life. At precisely 6 p.m., the curtains in the witness chamber were drawn open. On the other side of the glass, David Pittman lay strapped to the gurney, intravenous lines already in place. Behind the glass, family members of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles sat in silence, waiting for a conclusion that had been more than 30 years in making. When asked if he had any last words, Pittman spoke. His voice was calm, his message unwavering. He proclaimed his innocence. He denied killing the Knowles family and insisted the state was making a grave mistake. His words were steady, deliberate, and they hung heavy in the room. Moments later, the lethal injection began to flow. Pittman's chest rose and fell a few times. His eyes closed. Within minutes, his body grew still. At 6:16 p.m., the state of Florida pronounced David Pittman dead. He was 63 years old. Outside the prison, protesters recited prayers and sang hymns. Inside, the law had been carried out. The case finally brought to its judicial end. But death did not silence the questions. Pittman's execution sparked renewed debate. Had Florida carried out justice, or had it crossed a line into cruelty by executing a man many believed lacked the capacity to fully understand his fate? By dawn the next day, newspapers across Florida carried the same headline: Florida executes David Pittman after 34 years on death row. The victim's family had witnessed a conclusion they had waited decades for, and for them, it was closure. But for others, the execution raised troubling questions. Human rights groups condemned the state, pointing to Pittman's IQ scores and difficult upbringing. Legal analysts noted that while the courts had ruled against him, other states might have barred his execution under similar circumstances. Critics argued that Florida had ignored the evolving national conversation on the death penalty. For Governor DeSantis in the state, it was another carried-out sentence in a year defined by a tough stance on capital punishment. For the Knowles family, it was justice finally delivered. And for Pittman, it was the end of a 34-year struggle between guilt, appeals, and the shadow of death row. But his last words lingered, his unwavering declaration of innocence. And so the question remains, was David Pittman's execution the final chapter of justice, or will history remember it as another haunting mistake in America's long and controversial death penalty record?